Hi, my name is Sarah Brin. I'm a senior producer at Media Molecule, which is one of the third-party studios that are part of Sony Interactive. I kind of got involved with this project because my background is in art history and curatorial practice, and I spent a lot of time working in and with museums, helping them grow their digital infrastructure and also understanding the art history of games. So game development, like any other professional skill, is one that takes study and understanding. I think while some people might feel like it's simple to play games or unsophisticated to play games, I would argue that is not true. And it actually takes a lot of understanding to make a game that people actually want to play. So there's the prototyping process, right? Where you kind of figure out your sort of core idea and you figure out something called a mechanic. And a mechanic is the thing that you actually do in the game. And some games have obstacles or challenges, just like you would in like literature. What are the parts of the game development process? Well, I think that it can be really easy to overlook the complexity and skill that's involved with designing a game, because the act of playing a game can be something people think of as quite simple, but there is a huge distinction between making and playing a game. And so one of the key steps in designing a game is going to be prototyping. That's when you basically outline the skeleton of what your game is going to be, and you figure out what your core mechanic is. In gaming and game design, a mechanic is the thing you actually do in the game. So is it solving puzzles? Is it running? Is it jumping? Is it exploration? You might also decide to have a conflict or a challenge in your game. Some games are about exploration and kind of have that sort of sandbox feeling, but there might be kind of an obstacle or boss that you want to overcome, or a time limit or something like that. And another really important component is testing. And that's when you get real people to give you feedback on the game before it's done. I cannot emphasize this enough. You need to test a game before it's done, because you're going to find out a lot when you have people who are not actually part of the design process playing your game, because you as a designer, you as an expert are going to be kind of thinking about the same questions over and over and over again. So you're going to be stewed in this kind of information that a fresh player would not. And so it can be kind of a disheartening process that people play your game for the first time, but ultimately that is essential feedback. And it's your job as the designer to go back and iterate, make changes based on the feedback you received. I'm a big fan of a method called paper prototyping when it comes to developing games and testing them. And so what paper prototyping is that normally when we think of finished games, we might think of something that looks very polished. We might think of something digital. But when you are paper prototyping, you are making paper versions of all the things that might be digital or nicely printed in your game. And so when you do that, it means that when you realize there's a change you need to make, you can implement that much more quickly by writing on a Post-it, right? As opposed to like making it like a beautiful avatar, right? Or some stylized text. So that way, if you can kind of adapt your process before you've made it too finished and polished and fancy, then that's a huge win to be able to implement those changes early on in your process. How can cultural institutions connect in genuine ways with their audiences while doing these types of interactive experiments like games? Well, I think that it's really important to meet your players and meet your audiences where they're at, right? Institutions like museums or galleries are really loaded spaces in terms of the environment themselves can feel imposing, like a large building, usually a building that might feel, quiet or intimidating. Then there's like the perceived skill difference, right? So you have, museum staff or cultural workers that might come from a specific background. And if you come from places like I do, like in America, a lot of people don't have a lot of familiarity and comfort with the arts and the cultural sector. So there's already that feeling of intimidation there. So if you want to connect genuinely, I think kind of meeting someone on their turf might be a really important and interesting way to do that. So going outside of the space of your institution itself. Sometimes that might not be possible, but it's something to keep in consideration. And also thinking about the language and the format you use to engage with folks. You know, it can be really easy again to use really loaded jargon when you're talking about culture and when we're talking about institutions. And it can be easy to forget that some people, you know, don't necessarily know what the word discourse is, right? That's not a word they use casually, or a lot of those big museum words like generative and dialogical. So that those are some things to take into consideration, as well as I think it takes time, right, to develop this rapport. You can't just, you know, invite people into your office one day and expect, you know, someone to be your best friend. I think it takes time to develop trust, right? Because especially if you're thinking about the history of cultural institutions and a lot of indigenous cultures, it's been that conversation has been more of a lack of a conversation, right? That's more about like exploitation and appropriation and all of that stuff. So there isn't, like, you know, I live in England, so look at the British Museum. That's full of lots of important cultural artifacts from other places. To speak more specifically about games and interactivity, I think, you know, if you're, there's just like there's a literacy and just like there's a language for cultural heritage institutions and art history, there's also a language for gaming, right? And so you can't expect everyone who walks into your institution to know that language as well. So, you know, think for example, like a video game controller that's going to have two sticks on it, right? One is to control the camera and one is to control your movement. Dual stick controllers can be really, really hard to figure out if you don't play games all the time. So thinking about stuff like that, doing simplified controllers, or having people even in the gallery to help people use games, can be really, really, really important. Also, you know, that might resonate, that kind of language of gaming might resonate really well with, you know, younger audiences who you might not necessarily see a lot of in the museum. So that might actually be a really, really useful way to get people in. But a question I would pose is, how do you distinguish that experience of playing a game in a museum from playing a game at home? So what added value or what kind of nuance do you want to add there? And I think a lot of this has to do with the question of who is your target audience? Like, who do you want to reach? Because if you just come in with a blanket audience of everyone, that doesn't always work very well. So it's good to have a kind of a more specific, more tailored goal when you're trying something new. There's a social theorist called Arnstein, and he made this thing called the ladder of participation. And essentially what that is a kind of very basic breakdown of working with communities. And so, you know, just like we were talking about previously, it's collaboration with communities isn't just like about like, oh, which do you like better, a pink balloon or a green balloon, right? So that's a very kind of like lightweight form of participation. That's not co-creation, right? Like, so like part of the conversation would be not just planning a party together with the community, but being like, okay, like, do we want to have a party in the first place? What do we want to celebrate? What is important? Whereas I think a lot of cultural institutions might come to the conversation and be like, oh no, this is a participatory project because you got to have some of the cake. And they're like, well, we didn't even decide what kind of cake we wanted. So when you think about the ladder of participation, which is actually kind of a framework that was developed by this social theorist called Arnstein, it's a really interesting way to kind of evaluate how power is distributed within projects. So I think a lot of people think that they can come into a collaborative project and get feedback from a community towards the end of a project, but really if you want to be truly collaborative, you need to work from the ground up in terms of developing a programming design. So there's a lot to think about there, and it's actually extremely difficult because it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of strategy to find goals that are satisfactory to both, to a cultural institution and the community that they want to reach, because often they're not the same. I think when you're working with technology, it requires some organizational change, and it also requires some risk taking. So I think that some organizations might, if they really are invested in making change in the organization, they have to be willing to destabilize themselves, right? Because when that's what change is, change can and should be just destabilizing, because it's kind of reevaluating your principles, reevaluating organization, it's also reevaluating how power is communicated and built within an organization. And you also have to think about that when you're designing experiences for your public, if you are a cultural institution, right? So I think a lot of people, if they have a stressful everyday life, they're not necessarily going to want to be destabilized by engaging with culture. That could actually be the opposite of what they need in their everyday lives, because there might be other things that are quite destabilizing already. However, personally speaking, as an individual, not on behalf of any particular company or anything, I would argue that a lot of cultural heritage institutions need to be destabilized, because where I come from, especially at least in the United States, like there's so much of a deep interconnection between the cultural heritage sector and oil and pharma industries, right? And so if we think about the most pressing global and ecological issues of our time, I think a lot about climate change, right? And so how critical can we really be about climate change when we have oil and gas companies paying for these initiatives? And I know that there are some really wonderful initiatives going on now, like Museums Are Not Neutral, and a lot of like really good critique around BP, British Petroleum's work in the UK, but a lot of cultural institutions really need to reimagine their leadership structure and their funding structure if they are really going to be as progressive as we need them to be. There's a distinction to be made when it comes to thinking about gamely art, art that might have some kind of, flashy buttons in it, or a more perhaps provocative or nuanced interaction between art and culture and games. And the good news is that there are lots of already amazing creative practitioners who are working with games already. And so it's important for cultural institutions to loop in conversations with people like that, those artists, because there's a lot to be learned there about the process. And it's not, I think generally there are themes and ideas that they want to explore within their work, and that cultural institutions can and should learn more about how to exhibit that kind of work, how to support those types of artists as they're developing their work, as well as how exhibiting that kind of work really is quite a different phenomenon than exhibiting perhaps like a static artwork, like a painting or a sculpture. There is a tendency often to focus interest in arts and gaming exclusively on the aesthetic, which is fine. There's plenty of really, really beautiful games, and like just exploring an artwork as an aesthetic object is completely valid. However, to exclusively focus that discussion on the aesthetics would be a significant missed opportunity. There are plenty of artists who make work like time-based artworks, like experiential artworks. And, there's a long history of artists doing that, whether it's, Alan Cabral and Happenings, or if it's, the futurists or the situationists, this idea that an experience itself can be an artwork. And what's interesting with a game is that there is that answering back component, right? You have the player or the audience within a system, and it provides parameters to you that you can kind of bounce off and explore, which you can't necessarily do with a lot of other art forms. Like you can't like a painting can't necessarily talk to you back in the same kind of framework. And that's because there's a whole other set of values for understanding and appreciating different types of artwork. But the same is true for games. It can be very easy to overhype a particular type of technology and then subsequently accidentally overlook audience experience. And that's what happens when you start a design process focusing on like, okay, we have this technology, how can we use this particular thing? You see this happen with 3D printing, you see this happening with like VR headsets. And what I think is really important to do is think about the experiential takeaways that you want your audience to kind of feel and take away, and think and come back to that. Just like if you're building an organization, or if you're writing an essay, you're still going to have that thesis, right? You're going to have that kind of core value. And so that needs to be something that is revisited throughout a design process. And when you focus, when your core value is about the application of the technology itself, then it can be really easy to get lost along the way, and then nobody really wins there. And one example that I really loved of how the technology can really successfully complement a novel sort of exploration as an audience member is this project called Current Rising, which was put on by the National Opera House. And what that is a hyper reality opera. If you're not familiar with the term hyper reality, that is free range VR. So you've got your headset on, you've got a backpack with a computer in it, and you're walking around a physical space. I've done a lot of VR experiences that are just about like, whoa, you're in VR, isn't that cool? And I'm just like, oh, okay, my head kind of hurts. And I saw some stuff and I guess that was cool, but I don't, that was my primary experience of it. And Current Rising is a 15-minute opera, and it really just took advantage of the unique applications of free roam VR, because you're wandering around a physical space. And that's not an experience you get to have when you're at an opera, really. So the feeling of kind of like walking through a set as you have this beautiful score does actually really feel transcendent. And it was about kind of like isolation and separation. So there were times you could see the other people in your like little cohort doing the experience, and there were times that you couldn't. But that was really powerful, and that was really well done. And I think it was because, it does have this very kind of flashy word hyper reality in it, but ultimately the creators knew that it couldn't just be about the technology. It had to be about the opera, the experience. And I really liked that, because opera is usually not a very hands-on experience, and it can be a quite alienating experience as well, especially if you don't speak French or German or Italian. When we think about hybridity between arts and games, it's a really interesting thing, because I think a lot of games come from a hybridity from somewhere else, right? So games and a lot of technology have roots in the military-industrial complex. And so what's really interesting and really important to me is that we can't, or as a cultural producer, I cannot let the discourse and the conversations around these emerging technologies be shaped exclusively by military applications and commercial applications. And I think it's really important and really interesting to have artists work with these emerging technologies so we understand not only the full potential of what these technologies can do, but also we can be critical about them in the ways that other sectors cannot. And I think that is vital, because you often don't have like everyday people talking about or shaping the future of these technologies. Is usually left up to a very small amount of very specific, very privileged people. So as far as games are concerned, there's always there's always been a tendency to create art that people can interact with culturally. And, if you look at really old, ancient games of set or chess, historically, you'll see that these are, artisanal, crafted works that have so much beauty in the object themselves. But also, if you look back at artists like Duchamp, or Yoko Ono, you'll find that a lot of them made their own adaptations of chess as well. So I think that thinking critically is the ability to think within a system or a particular framework, in order to perhaps satirize or critique or explore within a particular framework. And I think that games are a really, really good method for doing that because they're closed systems. Usually they have a rule set and they have a start and a stop often. But I think it can be hard to draw the line where what comes from games and what comes from art. But I would say that, overall, a lot of discourse around games is shaped by industry, like I was talking about earlier. And I think it's really valuable and really interesting for artists to continue to be part of that conversation as well. So an example that I think is really interesting about contemporary technology is Dreams, which is the game I work with at my day job at Media Molecule. And what Dreams is a tool for making games and digital experiences, but also a way to play games and digital experiences created by other people. So essentially, it's a creative digital ecosystem that you can access on the PlayStation. So what I like about that is, historically, if you wanted to make a game that other people played, you had to be a big publisher like Blizzard or Sega, and you'd have to have millions of dollars to make a gigantic video game, and you'd have to be a whole big business. And now with tools like Dreams, but also tools like Roblox or Minecraft, you as an individual can build a game that thousands, if not millions, of other people can play. And I'm not saying there isn't a barrier to entry to those tools, but there absolutely is. But it is not the same and is not as significant as it has been historically. So I really like that, because that means there are more stories you can tell, more types of experiences, more mechanics you can discover, more ways to be creative, and more voices creating the games themselves. So yeah, I think that's pretty special. So if you look at, there's a really great example called Open Score, which was a Robert Rauschenberg piece created in collaboration with Bell Labs, a technology company, as part of their experiments in art and technology. And what that was is basically a tennis game that was where it was all about the kind of acoustic components of the game itself, rather than watching the game. And so as you had these two kind of players play, it almost created this kind of this musical piece, but it was kind of adapting this kind of familiar thing of ping pong or table tennis, and creating it into a score, right? And so if you look at, Fluxus artists, the idea of a Fluxus kit, right? These boxes that would essentially contain like all of these little toys inside, that were meant to be mass produced and disposable. That's the 1950s and 60s. Basically people sending each other tiny presents in the mail. I think that's another great example. Or like looking at Fluxus scores, like there's a beautiful Alison Knowles piece, and it's a Fluxus score, which that means it's just a set of instructions. There's this piece by Alison Knowles that's just make a salad. And so like you have your rules there, but also you have like a lot of space to work within those rules. Or there's the Jackson Mac Low piece that's draw a straight line and follow it. Right? So there are so many ways you can playfully adapt those scores, which I think is beautiful. And of course, you have, the futurist performances with the Russian futurists, in which, you know, they would put tax on their audience's chairs, which is a little much more antagonistic, I would say, than other forms of playful art. But this idea of like breaking the rules, of transcending the fourth wall, and kind of provoking your audiences to engage with you. Those are some interesting examples of game-like art behaviors. And, you know, I think that these games are a little bit more popular. They're games like, you know, Journey and Flower, which are created by a studio called That Game Company, which are not really zero-sum games. They're not really about competition or winning. It's more about like exploring an environment. And a lot of people have talked about those in art contexts. There's also, you know, some really incredible games that are about really tough subjects like depression and eating disorders. And these games can come across as really personal and intimate in ways that, I don't know, having an experience with lots of other people might not. So yes, there's just so much. And a great example of you know, the history of these games that's much more elaborate than what I can provide is a book called Critical Play by Mary Flanagan. And it's just basically a book about the art history of games. I think if you think about exclusively the aesthetic value of communicating rules, there have been some examples of how that's been done quite nicely. If you look at the game 16 Tons by Natalie Pozzi and Eric Zimmerman, like the rules are presented really beautifully, and they have this kind of, you know, cardboard, I think it's a laser etched kind of accordion like space that they create when you play the game. And I think that in and of itself has like a beautiful aesthetic dimension that is additional to the actual experience of playing the game itself. And I think, you know, there's this thing called attract modes, and what that is how games draw people in when someone's not actively playing them. So you'd see this in like an arcade, which I don't really know if a thing people go to or see anymore, but like, you know, you'd see the arcade with no one playing something at it, and you'd see some kind of gameplay examples on the screen. So those are some interesting examples of how, you know, there can be some interesting aesthetic work associated with the games without people actually playing them. And then there's also machinima, right? So that what that is making short films created with game engines that are not playable. And so sometimes these are really funny. Like one of my favorites is like a mod. So someone's made a change to the game Grand Theft Auto, and instead of like driving a car all over Los Angeles, this person's like playing a piano that's just like driving across the streets of Los Angeles, which I love a lot. But also, you know, there's an artist called Joseph Delap, who's really wonderful, who's done a lot of really great critical work with games. And he's done work with machinima as well, just kind of recording and documenting serious interactions he's had in massive multiplayer online games, which is not really a place where people have serious conversations, and the things that kind of happen when you engage regular game players or you know, game players in a play space with the real world, which is also very interesting. Earlier, we spoke about this idea that, you know, in order to make a game, you had to have a whole company behind you, right? And a business case and all that stuff. And it is really exciting that individual people and small studios can make these really beautiful, intimate, or provocative games. But then how do you get people to play them? That's really, really, really hard, right? So you can put them in a museum, right? But then you have to find a way to get a curator to figure out who you are, and for them to understand the entire kind of art historical, you know, trajectory of games and why games have art historical merit. And then you can also, you know, write a bunch of press releases, and you can send them to media and press. And that's a skill, a whole other skill that's unrelated to the skill of making games. And then if you think about online ecosystems for discovering games like Steam or the Apple Store or all that stuff, or even Roblox, you're really just at the whim of whoever is designing their front page and if they think your game is interesting or not. So yeah, we do have kind of a problem with discoverability for games, especially if they're created by people who don't already have like social or economic cachet. And that's a really, really tricky thing. So I always encourage artists to really cherish the art of the polite cold call, and just to learn, it's okay actually to email people with a link to your work and a couple questions and comments about how to get in touch, because otherwise, I think a lot of people care about doing interesting things, but and finding interesting work, but there's just so much out there. One of the projects that I'm the most excited about having worked on in my career is working with the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art on their Play SF MoMA initiatives, which is an initiative to show, support, and study artist-made games. And we've done a few incredible events through that, showing kind of more as a pop-up context, some of these really, really interesting artist-made games, which I'm really, really, really proud of. And it means a lot that a museum with a kind of like gravity of SF MoMA wants to explore that. And there's also, festivals. There's, I think so many of them have been decimated over the past 2 years through the pandemic, but there's Hand Eye Society in Toronto. There's, university crowds. There's like co-working spaces that put on their own kind of showcases of games. In LA, there's one called Glitch City, which is a co-working space, but they also will show work time from time to time. And then you have big festivals, like things like the Game Developers Conference or South by Southwest, and they'll usually have the games program there as well. There are, in New York, perhaps most notably, there are galleries that show games, especially there's one called Baby Castles, which is very much known for showing kind of experimental indie game work. Definitely spaces like this exist around the world. In London, where I am now, there's an organization called the Wild Rumpus. There's someone called Jim Monroe in Canada who's organized an organization called Gaia, Game Arts International some association. And basically what he does is he kind of, tracks and keeps track of all of the different kind of games scenes that pop up around the world. And there's definitely a lot of them, and they're growing, and I'm really, really excited about that. And I hope that we start to see live games events come back. Where do I think games are going and the arts are going in the near future? Well, I think that we will, perhaps quite cynically, we'll start to see a lot more of games and cultural heritage organizations, because they are without a doubt attractive to audiences. They get people in the door. And we saw at the Victoria and Albert Museum, we saw at the Smithsonian, their games exhibitions were huge successes. And those were also quite thoughtfully done, especially the one at the V&A. So I think we're going to continue to see art museums be interested in games. I think we need ongoing support in terms of helping push the medium of games along, in terms of providing that kind of critical feedback that is often missing from economic contexts. So thinking about, what makes something a strong artwork as opposed to something that's fun. That's a whole other conversation. And it can be fun, and things can be fun and be really meaningful artworks. Like, I'm a big Klaus Oldenburg fan. And like, I think a lot of his work is very much straddles that line. But, and I think we're going to continue to see technology play a huge role in the things that audiences tend to see. Just despite the hygiene issues associated with VR, I think people are still really fascinated with what VR can do. It gives me a headache, so I'm never, I really, really hope, and I want very much people to continue to see that AR is a really, really interesting tool for putting art in places where it isn't already. So art, it's a really interesting way to put art in public spaces. Oh my goodness. Mocha in Los Angeles did this really cool Pipilati wrist AR experience that I think is so good and worth checking out. But I think we'll only start to see cultural institutions develop more sophisticated understandings of what games are and what they can be. What I'd like to see is for cultural institutions to continue to develop their understanding and interest in the ways technologists and game designers are making art. And I think that could be really mutually beneficial in terms of boosting audience engagement, whether it's for a cultural institution's online presence or in their physical space. And I think there's also a huge benefit there for the artists and the creatives to benefit from that kind of critical eye and those kinds of questions that are often asked in art contexts. I hope to see meaningful and exciting and collaborative opportunities that take advantage of new technologies, because often you find that museums are late to the game when it comes to technological integration, and that is because of a variety of very real factors, including budget. But I hope to see that museums and cultural institutions will be funded in the future to experiment and continue to have a relationship with artists and continue to shift the way they think about collecting and exhibiting work.